So we had a fantastic travel in time, and thank you, Dirk Herder, for that. My focus will be much narrower. I will talk about the history of research on that issue of climate and migration, and I will also make some geographical considerations. Of course, the link between migration and the environment is extremely old, as we have just seen a few minutes ago, and it's only much later that scholars have started to try to understand the processes at stake. Nevertheless, and also because it's a fantastic and ironic citation, I just wanted to quote as a start Tacitus, the Roman historian, who in 98 had that sentence: who would dare to leave Asia, Africa, or Italy to move to Germany? An horrible country with terrible landscapes, a harsh climate, grim to live in and to travel through. I guess this was a sentence for Angela Merkel in 2016. But anyway, what is interesting for us is that, as you see, climate is mentioned as one of the reasons, well, in that case, not to go somewhere. And indeed, if you look at the founders of migration studies, the pioneers of migration studies in the 19th century, you will find climate and the environment as central drivers in the way they started to theorize migration. Take, for example, Friedrich Ratzel, the German geographer. For him, climate and the environment is one among two main drivers of migration throughout history, beside political turmoils. And the same can be said about Ravenstein. Although Ravenstein, the British geographer who produced those very, very famous laws of migration, also mentioned the climate as an important driver. Unattractive climate has produced and is still producing currents of migration. It's true that for Ravenstein, economic dimensions and the direct economic impact were more important than the environment in general. But nevertheless, he made the link between those different dimensions. More recently, in America this time, Ellen Churchill Semple, who was one of the first woman geographer appointed as professor at the university, also mentioned in her history of the conquest of America that the search for better land, milder climate, and easier conditions of living starts many a movement of people. Even if we leave the German or English-speaking world and look at Jovan Cvic, the famous Serbian geographer who actually wrote a large part of his work in French in La Sorbonne, for him the natural environment plays an important role in migration as it impacts on economic productivity and resources. Soil infertility and bad crops are important drivers of accelerators of emigration. It was 1918 in La Péninsule Balkanique, this huge monography that Cvic produced on the Balkanic region. And finally, in a very different intellectual context, Kropotkin, the anarchist, in 1902, also mentioned that migration is indeed one of the three outcomes in case of climate hazards, beside two others: conflicts, competition between people affected by hazards, and the outcomes that Kropotkin wished and was advocating, of course, fraternity and cooperation. And so you see that in different parts of the world, in different intellectual circles, this idea that the environment and the climate was linked to the movement of people was very well established. But then, and that is probably the surprise, it nearly disappeared during the process of constitution of what we now call migration studies. If you look at some of the landmarks of migration studies during the next century, namely the 20th century, you will find much less mentions of either the natural environment or the climate than among the scholars of the 19th century. Human Migration by Gregory, 1928, Human Migration, Taft, 1936, Economics of Migration, those landmarks, pioneer landmarks of migration studies, do not address the issue of the environment. And if you look more broadly at the main theoretical families that are addressing the issue of migration, you will neither find much about an impact of the natural environment or the climate. Everett Lee, in probably what is the most cited migration paper in history on the push-pull model, does indeed mention the climate, but very incidentally. He just mentioned that a good climate is attractive and a bad climate is repulsive for nearly everyone. That's the sentence. But that's all. The paper, as you probably know, is very short anyway. In other famous schools of thought, the environment and the climate are completely absent. The neoclassic new economics of migration theory, the 1970s, 1980s, does not mention the environment. It's true that the environment is there, hidden behind the level of wages, for example. The central idea of the neoclassic theory is that it's the differences between the wages of different areas that drives migration. And of course, if the climate is very bad, if the environment is terrible, then probably the wages have to compensate, in a sense, these differences. So everything is integrated in economic variables such as wages for the neoclassics. But nevertheless, although it is arguably hidden somewhere, it remains that the issue is not directly addressed at all in those theories. Marxist theories, post-Marxist theories, structuralist theories, the world system theory also do not mention the environment. The central driver of migration for those schools of thought is, again, the economy, the class dimension, and the power relations between different groups of people who are indeed exploiting nature, but the environment is not addressed as such. And finally, in more recent theories of migration, for example, the network theory, globalization theories, the status of the environment is also very marginal. So, in a sense, the first part of my story is that of disparition. But as in every good crime novel, there has to be a reapparition. And indeed, the environment, as you know, and that's also why we are here, and the climate, did reappear in migration debates, and very prominently at a later stage in history. But before this reapparition, maybe we should try to understand the reasons why the environment and the climate disappeared from migration theory at a first stage. And I see four explanations for that disappearance. The first one is the Western idea that progress and modernity implies a decreasing impact of nature on societies. In a sense, society's destiny was to get free from the constraint of nature. And this is very prominent if you look at the famous typology of migration by Peterson in 1958. Peterson's offer a broad typology of all forms of migration, which still is extremely interesting today. And among the types of migration that Peterson identified, there is what he calls primitive migration. And primitive migration, for Peterson, are the migration in distant history that were directly caused by the environment. But these, for Peterson, are things from the past. These are the features of migration that were affecting societies that were heavily dependent on the environment for their living. And in the views of Peterson, those kinds of migration, hence the name primitive, were to disappear. They were still witnessed in some parts of the world, but progress, modernity, would allow men to get free from those constraints. So that's most probably one important reason why in the course of the 20th century, when progress was seen as the destiny of humanity, the consideration of migration that might be caused by the environment faded away. But there are other explanations. Another one has to do with the demise of natural determinism. For those of you who are familiar with the history of geography, you certainly know that determinism, natural determinism was very strong in geography, especially at the beginning of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, sorry, end of the 19th century. I just mentioned Ellen Churchill Semple. And Ellen Churchill Semple made very interesting research on the peopling of America, for example. But she also was heavily influenced by natural determinism through her master, Friedrich Ratzel, who was her master's at the University of Berlin. And she, for example, took for granted that climate had an influence on human personalities, namely that people living in more temperate climate were more clever, more entrepreneurial, and that people living in southern climate were lazy, not very active, etc., which was a very common opinion among geographers at that time, dating back to Hippocrates and to Montesquieu, the famous theory of climate, which is a theory of a link between psychology and climate. And this is directly the product of environmental determinism, which was, for obvious reasons, harshly criticized during the second part of the 20th century. And in geography, this critique of natural determinism led to a certain extent to expelling all natural environmental dimensions from the explanations of society during a certain period. And probably this contributed also to maybe going a bit too far in expelling these natural dimensions from the explanations in geography. Then the third explanation has probably to do with the growing dominance of an economic paradigm in migration theory. More and more with the neoclassic economic theory, all other considerations, be they politic or environmental, were considered as secondary variables in the explanation of migration, except perhaps in one subfield of migration studies, namely forced migration studies. Logically, what was called at that time refugee studies could have addressed the issue of migration connected with environmental destructions. But the birth of refugee studies was linked to a major development in international law, the 1951 Convention on Refugees. And the 1951 Convention on Refugees precisely does not address the issue of so-called refugees from the environment. It is targeted toward political refugees, in some cases refugees from violence, but not linked with other variables. And refugee studies, as they developed within that framework of the refugee conventions, did not, in fact, address neither the issue of the environment as a driver of migrations, the motto being that states make refugees. So these are, in my view, the main explanations for the disappearance, and in a sense, things could have stopped there. But as I just mentioned, then came, in a sense, by surprise, the reappearance of the environment-migration nexus. Around the 1980s, I would say, with a very famous paper, much cited, by Issam El-Hinawi, report of the United Nations Environmental Programme on soil degradation, which coined the concept of environmental refugees. This word had already been used before, but he was the one who, to a certain extent, was the most cited and popularized it at that time. The end of the 1980s was also the period when the first IPCC report, 1990, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Synthesis of Existing Knowledge on Climate Science, 1990, which mentioned that the gravest effects of climate change may be those on human migration, as millions will be displaced. So as you see, suddenly, the issue is back in the debate. And an Oxford environmentalist, Norman Myers, was very active in putting this debate to the fore during the 90s with a very dramatic tone. 1997, for example, the issue of environmental refugees promises to rank as one of the foremost human crises of our times. And Myers also gave some numbers. And you know, when you have numbers, it immediately gives any statements a much larger echo. And he had a forecast of 150 million environmental refugees for the end of the 20th century. Those forecasts by Myers were very problematic. And Richard Black, who happens to be here, made a harsh critique of this idea of a direct link between the environment and migration, and of the methodology of those calculations in 2001. But nevertheless, the issue was back on the agenda, despite the fact that in many of the papers of that time, and especially in the media echo to those papers, the issue of monocausality was prominent, namely the simple idea that the climate could alone create migration was overemphasized. So if we want to look more precisely at what happened after this reappearance, I have to say a few words about a database that we are maintaining at the University of Neuchâtel. This is very simply a collection of bibliographic references related to migration and the environment. In other words, we are collecting the literature on the basis of scientific criteria. Every week we make a kind of web research of the literature. Then we select what we consider as scientific papers according to the IPCC criteria, and we implement specific keywords in order to be able to compare the different papers regarding their methods, regarding the regions where they are investigating, regarding specific focus that they might have, gender, etc., and regarding the type of hazard that they are addressing. This database is online. You can access it, and I encourage you to try to use it if you are doing research on that topic. In the case of what I will just present now, we have used this database in order to trace the evolution of research on the topic during the last decades. And this gives the following result, namely an impressive increase in the number of publications on the topic migration, environment, climate change. You have two different informations here. You have the total of scientific publications, so paper in scientific journals, a book published by scientific publishers, or working papers, provided that they are not published subsequently as in a journal, they wouldn't be counted twice, and provided they are published in working paper series which are maintained by renowned research institutes. So we are controlling the solidity of the publications. These are again the IPCC criteria, which allow to include some gray literature, but not all gray literature. Anyway, this gives us about nowadays 100 publications a year, which is quite a lot on the topic. And the second information in gray concerns case studies only, namely publications with an empirical dimension. In the total, we also count, for example, publications by lawyers on the international law and environmental refugees. In the case studies, we have only empirical work by geographers, anthropologists, etc. So what we can see on that graph, which goes from 1970 to more or less present, is that there has been, in a sense, a first rediscovery of the issue around 1990s, precisely when, as you have seen, the publication by Helena were done, and the first IPCC report, 1990. But at a moderate level, this is the period when we had those debates that I have just mentioned between, say, alarmists like Norman Myers and more cautious critics of those alarmist stances. This lasted up to the end of the 2000, more or less. Then I would say that a pragmatic line developed among researchers, namely that most people accepted the idea that it was impossible to make overall forecasts of a number of environmental refugees, that the very concept of environmental refugees was not very helpful because of multi-causalities, which are always present. And for that reason, literature developed along a pragmatic line of empirical research, which indeed gave birth to a very, very steep increase in the number of publications. The year 2007 is a crucial year regarding that development. I would not consider 2011 as a very specific year. This is a bit of a hazard that such a number of publications was done. It is linked to a very specific large research project in the UK, which was very successful. But I consider that from 2005 up, from 2010 up to today, we are at a high level of research with about 100 publications a year and about 40 case studies a year. But the interesting moment is probably 2007, and as we have tried to understand the reason why the environmental dimension has disappeared from migration studies during the first part of the 20th century, we could now try to understand why around 2007, at the beginning of the 21st century, such a strong reappearance occurred. And well, it is not a big surprise, but a major explanation has to do with the growing environmental concerns that developed during the 1970s. The 1970s, the Club of Rome report, landmark publications such as Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, one of the first book on the issue of biodiversity and the impact of pesticide on biodiversity appeared. So suddenly, humanity, or at least a part of humanity, realized that it had disastrous impact on the environment, which was not such an issue during the first part of the 20th century. So these were general environmental concerns. Then came the climate anxieties of the 90s. Again, first IPCC report is 1990. And the Stern review of the economic effects of climate change was also a landmark precisely in 2007, stating greater resource scarcity, desertification, risks of drought and floods, and rising sea levels could drive millions of people to migrate. So this is, in my view, the first general obvious explanation about the renewed interest that we have witnessed. But there is probably another explanation which has to do with the way migration was framed in the political discourse, and especially in the way the framing of migration in the political discourse met those fears of climate change and environmental degradation. If you look at this quotation, which also dates from this precise period, 2008, from Javier Solana, the EU High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy, such migration may increase conflicts in transit and destination areas. Europe must expect substantially increased migratory pressure. You can see here that there is not only a fear of climate change, not only a fear of environmental degradation, not only a fear of a loss of biodiversity, but a fear of migrants. And those fears came together and led to a renewed interest, concern for those issues. The first meeting of the UN Security Council on the issue of climate change also happened in 2007, and during that meeting, the issue of migration was prominent. And if you look at the publications of that time, you will find publications by researchers from universities, but you will also find quite many publications by military research circles, for example, or intelligence research circles, who were concerned about the consequences of climate change on migration and the consequences of those migrations on security. So that's what I call a securitization of migration. Securitization means that a topic is suddenly seen as a security issue. That's the idea behind the concept of securitization. This idea is well captured by Thomas Feist already in 2006 in a paper on the migration security nexus. He said, increasingly, fears of communist takeover and infiltration have been replaced in popular and mass media coverage by more diffuse perceptions of transnational threats associated with organized crime, drug trafficking, and environmental disasters, and not to forget international migration. It happens that the topic of migration and climate change precisely conflates two of those fears in a very visible way. Which leads to the migrants suddenly becoming the human faces of climate change. This was this is a term which was used by the former chair of the IPCC, Rajendran Pachauri. He said the migrants are the human faces of climate change. This was, in a sense, a very important tool, image for advocacy against climate change. It was possible to explain to the people that climate change had not only consequences on the micrograms of gases in the atmosphere or on the mean temperature, which would vary from 1 to 2 degrees, which was not very frightening for the people. Talking about migrants was a much more powerful tool of advocacy. And in that sense, this was an interesting addition to the debate. But simultaneously, as I have just mentioned, this was associated with the fear of migrants in general. And this was, of course, a problematic association. This also led to a framing of climate refugees as a southern problem and as a security risk for the north. If you look at media pictures that are used when the theme of migration linked to climate change is made, you will most often find colorful southern people who are very often with their foot in the water, such iconic pictures which are related to environmental migration. There is, in that sense, a racialization, an exotization of climate refugees. Very seldom you have considerations about Swiss people who might be displaced due to the collapse of the touristic economy, following the disappearance of snow, for example. Although this is definitely an issue. And this also led to a bias in the geography of research on those issues, which is surprising, because if you look at the geography of climate research, and there are very interesting papers on that topic, there is a bias toward the north, namely issue related to the atmospheric consequences of climate change are mainly researched by the north, in the north. Issues related to migration are researched in the south, but by the north, as I will show you in minutes. We have been able to map this due to the CLIMIC database that I have just mentioned. And here is the map of the case studies that I just mentioned. We have about 532 case studies which are identified with a specific field work. And as you can see, case studies are conducted everywhere, which is also a sign of the new dynamism of that research on migration and environmental change, but with a clear difference between Europe and Africa. Africa is clearly the playground of research on migration and the environment. So, of course, this has to do with the fact that populations in some countries of Africa are more vulnerable, are poorer, that environmental hazards might impact them much more. So it makes sense, to a large extent, to make research in those areas. But nevertheless, it's interesting to keep in mind that imbalance that we witness. And that imbalance is also clear within southern countries. For example, Central Asia, which is highly sensitive to climate change, is massively under-researched regarding the links with migration. And also areas of Europe which might be impacted are not on the agenda of researchers. Again, this has to do with what Thomas just mentioned in the introduction, namely that if the Netherlands the last decades. It is also striking, again understandable but striking, that the funding of research is coming from the north. We have been able to connect the papers published with the funding of research, not in all cases. We have only here 223 cases, but when possible, we have made that link. And most often, studies in Africa are funded by the European Commission or different financing bodies of the North. Again, nothing new, nothing completely surprising, but important to have in mind that there is a specific geography also of that research. So obviously, there is a process of putting that topic on the agenda, which is complex, which has to do with political issue, which led to bias in research, which have to be taken into account. But nevertheless, we have had now 2 decades or 3 decades of very productive research on the topic, which allows to draw some elements of conclusion. If I had to synthesize what we now know about those issues, I will mention 5 points. First of all, definitely the issue is serious, namely climate change might have a significant impact in terms of displacements, although those displacements are not yet easy to identify and not yet easy to link with climate change. But definitely for the future, this is a very, very serious issue. Nevertheless, there is no systematic link. There is no such thing as a direct impact of climate change on migration. The correlations in the case studies are very often weak. What do I mean by this? I mean that most case studies are using multi-variable analysis. It can be ethnographic studies taking into account multiple dimensions, or it can be very sophisticated statistics, multivariables analysis. But in all cases, the level of correlation specific to the climate variable is usually quite weak. The political drivers, the economic drivers are more or at least as important as the climate. And this has to be kept in mind, because much too often people are considering that climate or the environment alone could lead to migration. There is multi-causality, always. Crises are man-made. Even if at the beginning of a crisis there is a natural hazard, the outcome of that hazard are man-made. And there is no pure natural hazards, and there are no pure climate or environmental migrants. There is always a mix of causality. Political and economic variables are more important very often than the environment. There have been, in very recent years, several publications that are using huge databases to analyze the link between the number of asylum seekers coming to Europe, for example, and temperatures and other environmental variables in the origin countries. And some of those studies do find a correlation which led to big titles in the media. But if you look at the strength of those correlations, they are indeed statistically significant, which is extremely interesting scientifically. But nevertheless, it has to be kept in mind that most often other variables are interacting, and that is what has to be understood. And it cannot be simply said that the environment or the climate is causing displacement. Then another important conclusion is that a distinction has to be made between different consequences of climate change. Sudden events, hurricanes, for example, and slow onset events, for example, sea level rise, have completely different impacts on mobility. In some cases, hurricane, we have short-term displacement. In other cases, we have to plan for long-term relocation, but with a very, very slow process, which allow for some adaptation measures. So a very differentiated approach has to be implemented. And migration is also a coping mechanism in some cases. The idea that migration was one of the numerous bad consequences of climate change is an oversimplification. It can very well be the case for a fisherman village in Senegal that having financial transfers from those of the village who have moved elsewhere can be the way precisely to adapt the livelihood to the changing environment. So migration is not necessarily the symptom, it's also part of the cure. Another important result that has to be mentioned regarding the media discourse is that there is no major risk for Europe to be suddenly flooded by environmental refugees, which is a fear which is very present in the public opinion. most displacement, if there are displacement, will be much more local. And finally, the number of people who will be forced to migrate will depend on the level of investment and planning in order to cope with those developments. So these are more or less the main results. I will not elaborate on that. We have the rest of the day to discuss that. But I will just conclude by mentioning a series of open questions. As you mentioned that this event is also intended to be the start of a process of discussion within Finland, I guess, on those issues. So I've just tried to sort out what are, after 30 years or so of research, the most pressing questions. There are certainly others which are as important, but these are those who came to my mind regarding processes, populations, and policies. Regarding processes, there is the issue of thresholds and non-linearities. Are there thresholds regarding this link between population and environmental degradation? Obviously, there are, but is it possible to better identify them? This is not an easy task, and this is a very interesting question. What about repeated hazards? We know that if one hurricane destroy a village, most people will perhaps move for a few months to take shelter, but then very often they will come back, they will reconstruct, so no consequences in terms of long-term migration. But what if the frequency of those hazards increase so much as to be a risk from year to year for the populations? Then it might have other impacts on migration. What are the interactions between environmental drivers of migration and other variables? Gender, class, race. This is a very important issue that has been also already studied, but that deserves much more research. What about indirect impacts? There was that huge debate 2 years ago regarding the Syrian conflict. Some researchers were arguing that the drought in part of Syria had an impact on mobility of populations, and that the mobility of populations had an impact on social unrest, and that social unrests were the beginning of the Syrian crisis. This was obviously an oversimplification, but nevertheless, that issue of the indirect impact is obviously a very interesting one. What about immigration toward environmentally vulnerable areas, which is something which is what we witness currently? Currently, the cities which are really under threat of sea level rise are also the parts of the world where the highest number of migrants are coming, not leaving, but coming, which of course raises important issues. Regarding populations, how do affected populations themselves frame the issue? How do they make sense of what's happening? Because that's what leads them to decide if they want to move or not. What about immobility? What about trapped populations? That might be the most affected by the environmental degradations. And regarding policies, is mobility a possible coping strategy to our environmental change? How? That is linked with the idea that migration can be a response. How to frame relocation policies when necessary? And how to evaluate the way relocated population fare. Very often, the results of research show that relocated populations face quite important difficulties. And it is important to monitor those displacements, which are not very common in Europe, but starting to take place on a large basis in China, for example, but also in some parts of Africa. So these are some of the questions that I have identified that we can discuss further later in the day. To conclude, we have a long history of research, not longue durée, a few decades, but nevertheless a significant number of publications, as I have showed you. We have important bias with influences of the socio-political context, which have led to a framing of the very issue which is not completely satisfactory, as I have shown. But we have solid results, many new questions, very difficult forecasts. It is definitely impossible to give numbers regarding future overall environmental migration, although it is possible more sectorally, probably, to make scenario. But there is one forecast that I can offer you at the end of this talk, and this forecast also justify us being here, and it is the forecast that very probably the number of publications in the future on that topic will be on the rise. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Piguet. That was very nice. Here's our small gratitude.
Thank you. Thank you.
This is not maybe directly a question to you, but maybe hearing your opinion. The International Organization for Migration, IOM, has been active in this field now for a few years, and they do also provide a portal, an internet-based portal regarding various type of information on this. So what is your opinion on the IOM's service and its role in this this entity?
Well, first of all, I would say that it's very useful that IOM has done that job of collecting information, of offering opportunities of publication, of also sometimes financing research on those issues. I must confess I have benefited from some of this, and the CLIMIC database has benefited, so I'm not neutral regarding that issue. So that's clearly part of the dynamics that we witness today around those issues, and this is excellent. Of course, one also has to be aware that there are different international organizations dealing with those issues, and that there is a certain competition sometime between those entities, and it is also interesting to compare the way UNHCR is dealing with the issue with the way IOM is dealing with the issue, which is not the same. And of course this leads us back to the issue of the socio-political context and also the institutional context in which those initiatives are developing. And as social scientists, we have, of course, also to be aware that this is a dimension of research. But nevertheless, I think that regarding the political significance of those issues, regarding the human consequences that those processes have, it remains a good thing that an institution like IOM has seized this issue and is contributing to research on that topic.
Thank you. That was a very diplomatic answer. We have 5 questions here in the audience, so we'll take them now.
Thank you so much. I'm extremely impressed with your database and the research. I've got a question where I'd appreciate your perspective, having analyzed the research that's come out in this field. So you say you're observing quite significant bias, racial bias in particular, in terms of where climate change research is done, who funds it, and rightly say it's not a surprise, it's still quite worrying. But then you're concluding that you've got solid findings, and I'd like to hear your reflection on that, because if research is biased in quite such a problematic way, then assuming that that finds its way into the methodology, and especially the kind of more scientific methodology is always, you know, portrayed as neutral, which is problematic. So how can the findings be solid when the methodology is potentially very problematic? Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent question. I would say that I believe that despite the fact that research is very often done by northern researchers in southern countries with northern fundings. I had a third map with the origin of the researchers, which showed the same as the fundings. A bit less impressive, but it shows the same. So I believe that despite this bias, a large part of the results of the empirical case studies remains solid. I mean, I'm confident that they are doing a good job when certain questions are addressed, such as the amplitude of the degradations, the numbers of people who have been displaced. I think the results remain solid, but, and that's my answer to your question, depending on the type of questions that are asked, then the bias are much more important. And especially regarding one of the questions which I mentioned as a future research question, namely understanding the way populations are framing those issues, are making sense of the issue. For such a question, then I really think that if the research is done by northern researchers with funding from the north, the results are not very satisfactory. And especially regarding those kinds of questions, it can really be hoped that in the future more research will be done in an autonomous way in southern countries, as it is already the case in some countries. And of course, we haven't studied the card very precisely, the map very precisely, but Kenya, for example, has funded some research. India has funded some research. China, of course, and this is a developing trend. I mean, these are the most recent research. But as you can see, obviously, there is still a long way to go.
I had a question about that you say that we're now sort of in a pragmatic stage of that we agree that it's multi-causal, etc., and are a bit more nuanced in our research, which I think is the case indeed with, if you go to the conferences in Europe, at least everybody seems to agree on that. But I do wonder, in recent years, you see more and more, somewhat more alarmist publications coming up again, especially in the light of climate conflict, and a lot of them are coming from the US. So, I wonder, therefore, do you see also sort of different schools depending on the continent, and therefore also the funding, because in the US I think more the funding is sometimes you have to make it a bit more about security or conflict in order to do the type of research. So I'm just wondering if you see such differences.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this question. This is, you are perfectly right. Probably linking asylum requests and environmental variables. I wouldn't say this comes in very often other journals than the one in which the most publications were done in the past, and they are in a way disconnected from the existing literature. but they have quite a large impact, very often because they are based on, by the way, very interesting and huge databases. I wouldn't necessarily put the line between the United States, mainly between the United States and Europe. I would rather draw a disciplinary line, namely very often these are publications by economists, econometricians who are expanding their range of investigations to non-directly economic issues. And I've been to several conferences where such results were presented, and it's really a quite different circle of people than the one who has been active previously. And it's always also difficult to enter in discussion because of methodological differences, namely when you have a very sophisticated econometric analysis, you feel that the authors are overemphasizing the impact of one variable, but you cannot get as in a standard regression model, you can get a partial correlation. At least you can measure the impact of one variable compared to the other. If you have a very sophisticated econometric model, it's much more difficult for somebody who is not into it to really try to say, okay, the temperature variability has a significant impact on asylum requests in Europe. Okay, this means that statistically it has an impact, but statistically significant doesn't mean important impact. It's two different things, and very often it's difficult to enter in discussion with those groups. And I think that definitely the next step would be for those different traditions to get together and talk together. But sometimes I got the impression from some of the recent publications in top journals that that's not very diplomatic for me to say, but that the teams that were publishing those publications were not necessarily very interested to enter into a discussion. They were interested to publish one paper because they had spotted that field and they had a good database, but not that much interested about building a kind of collective knowledge on the basis of the existing literature. So it's sometimes difficult.
Thank you so much for your presentation and the ongoing discussions we are having. I'm behind the pillar, sorry.
Sorry. It comes from here, your voice comes from here. So.
Yeah. I had a question in mind regarding the research bias as well, but since we already discussed it, I'm just going to give my brief comment on it. I think we are also facing similar problems when it comes to migration research, in particular refugee studies or forced migration studies. And I would think that in the future, and we really need like multidisciplinary research themes when it comes to environmental change and migration, and in particular researchers with sort of post-colonial critique and sort of understanding on the politics of knowledge production. But my question is, I was rather surprised that in your future research or open questions slide, you had hardly anything or nothing on the legal frameworks. And I wonder if the legal scholars have already come up with all the right solutions for this. And I'm not a legal scholar myself, I'm a geographer as well, but I would be interested in your perspective on whether in particular when it comes to international migration, forced displacement, crossing borders, whether we have really solved the protection issues. Thank you.
Thank you. This is absolutely correct. There is a field of investigation which is identified, by the way, in our database. Those publications normally are included, which deal with legal issues. And definitely, I'm sure there are still very interesting research questions in that context. The fact is that I'm either not a lawyer, and my impression is that to a certain extent, the main gaps in protection regarding those kinds of migration existing in international and national laws have been identified. We know that there are gaps. That one way, but Ingrid, you certainly have much more to say about that, to answer to those gaps, which would be to create a new binding legal international text, is to a larger extent a dead end, because simply it is unrealistic, at least in the near future. So that in a sense, I don't see really big questions which might still be associated with those issues at this stage. My impression is that through what was called the Nansen Initiative, you have perhaps heard of this initiative by Professor Walter Kehlin, and now the platform on disaster displacement, which is based in Geneva. There is an attempt to build a code of good practices regarding transborder migration linked with environmental hazards. So there are initiatives which are underway, and again, there are not, in my view, very obvious remaining legal questions. But I might be completely wrong, and perhaps there are several very interesting questions that should be mentioned. I do not pretend to be correct.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and for sure your database is very valuable for our research. My question is related to the type of research that I understand. Naturally, most of the research currently is about reasons behind migration, and especially if you speak about climate change and refugees, so reasons behind it. What about research on how refugees or migrants can adapt to the new climate, or if they need to move from one climate region to another climate region? Is there any research on adaptation to new climatic conditions?
Yes. Okay, thank you. I would like to ask about the integrated assessment models. You mentioned that you don't, or if I understood correctly, that you don't believe in exact forecast. But the scientific community has prepared the representative concentration pathways and used integrated assessment models to turn the narratives into numbers, like in shared socioeconomic pathways. So what do you think, what should be done to improve these models?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. First, regarding adaptation, just as the more specific question of migration as adaptation, the question of adaptation of people after migration is an important question. There are some publications on that topic. We have a specific keyword on adaptation in our database, but it definitely remains an under-researched issue. And especially, as I mentioned, regarding populations that are relocated for very obvious environmental reasons. I know of a case study, for example, in Senegal, in the northern coast of Senegal, where fishermen villages have been displaced because the erosion has simply wiped away their part of the village, and very often the conditions of living are extremely problematic, and this is definitely an issue that that would deserve more studies. Then, regarding integrated assessment models, I do not believe that it is possible to produce aggregated numbers as Norman Myers did in the 1990s. This makes no sense. But this doesn't mean that I do not believe that it is possible for specific processes to try to modelize in a multi-factorial way the processes, and with caution to produce numbers. And I think especially at local level, when it is possible really to involve in the model many different dimensions, then it is a very promising development. And I know that, for example, close to where I work, the International Displacement Monitoring Center in Geneva, with whom we are currently collaborating, is trying to develop such models. Well, there are many other initiatives, and I think this is quite interesting, definitely.
Okay, 2 questions.
Thank you for your presentation. My question deals with the topic of future, because you mentioned a few times about the future implications, the major future implications of climate change. And when I was interviewing 2 years ago Nordic migration researchers on the future themes and trends in the research field, they said the very same thing, that it's a future trend and theme first and foremost. So which kind of future is this that we're talking about? When researchers say future, do they just mean like not quite yet, or is it something more specific? Are there any like specific event horizons being suggested or sketched after Myers and the alarmists, and is it still a thing?
Thank you, Professor Etienne Piguet, of your very inspiring presentation. It came to my mind while you were mentioning these growing environmental concerns in the 1970s, that in that time there was this report of the Rome Club, and it was a lot of discussion about this, what is the capacity of the Earth? Can it be 1.5 or 2 or even 3, the same amount of population what we had that time? It was really a hot topic. And then about these current research questions about this immigration toward environmentally vulnerable areas, it came to my mind, for example, California, which is very like a popular place where people move all around, and it has its natural amenities. But there has been a long time a discussion of these earthquakes and so on, that how people dare to live there. I remember from 1989 when I was driving there by car, and there was an earthquake in San Francisco, and there was this Bay Bridge broken, and it was like really concretely seen that it really affects. And also another thing which came to my mind is these tsunamis, what we have seen in Japan and in Thailand and in Hawaii. And these people are willing to stay in place. They want to rebuild, and they want to be prepared for the next tsunami wave. And this is something like there are these people who are willing really to stay in place.
Thank you. I think, answer quite briefly. Regarding the future, I think we are going to discuss this issue of the future largely this afternoon. So the only thing I could say on the basis of my investigation of the existing research is that usually most studies which are dealing with the future have an horizon of about the end of this century. Morally, that's more common. That's what more commonly we call the future. But this could be discussed, of course, and probably this afternoon we will have the opportunity to do that. But the forecasts are very often set to the end of the century, not further, and this is probably interesting. Regarding the various points that you mentioned, I agree with many of your remarks, especially the last point regarding the fact that people are attached to where they live mostly, and this is very often something which is forgotten when there are those media fears about huge waves of migrants, be they environmental migrants or simply migrants from poverty. The numbers of people who do wish to migrate remains a small proportion, and there are many studies which are documented this in various parts of the world, and this has to be kept in mind also in cases of environmental issues. Regarding earthquakes and tsunamis, these are of course not in our portfolio of environmental hazards, because they are not at least directly linked to climate change. But these are very interesting cases because, of course, analogies are possible when you can document the consequences of an earthquake, because you see that the migration processes, if they exist, can have some commonality with what might happen after a hazard that would be linked to climate change. So it's also very interesting to be taken into account.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. You mentioned bias in research as well as seeing, bias in research in terms that we northern study southerns, and we see environmental change or climate change also as a problem of the south. Which simultaneously we securitize migration largely. And my question is a little bit more practical. Do you think that this type of securitization of migration in terms of, for example, environment, that we see it as an uncontrollable flow of migrants, has had some practical implications, for example, in migration policies or visa policies per se, especially in the southern context?
Definitely, yes. I think there has been, I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk, the 2015-2016 rise in the number of asylum requests addressed in Europe, and there was obviously a panic regarding that migration and an absence of coordination between maybe not all of the European countries, maybe some were not to be included because it was not possible, but at least within a certain number of European countries, it seems that it would have been possible to at least have a minimal level of coordination, which was absolutely not the case. And this definitely, in my view, has to do with this undifferentiated fear of a kind of wave of migrants coming from various reasons, from environmental issue to war and violence. Whereas if you analyze 2015-2016, you see that it is very clearly related to a few countries, of course, especially Syria, where there was a very, very clearly identified human rights and violence problem, which had also to do with the situation in the camps that were at the borders in Turkey, in Jordan, in Lebanon, where the conditions of living were simply impossible. And this was, in a sense, a very manageable issue, which was completely lost of sight due to a large extent, this kind of overall fear of a general security threat of all migrants. I would say this is a very banal answer, but that's my answer.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting speech. I'm thinking, actually connected to the previous question and also connected to these current research questions, I'm just thinking still about, you talked about this fear of migrant, and I'm just thinking that, as you say, I mean, we don't really know what the future will be, but this fear in itself is a real factor, and it has huge consequences. So nation states, EU are investing really incredible sums at this moment to produce kind of technologized boundaries. So these, of course, also affect I mean, you have this question about whether mobility is a possible coping strategy. I mean, these huge efforts to kind of stop migrants also affect this whole scenario in a way. So I'm just thinking that can you kind of can you study this environment mobility nexus and then forget the state?
Thank you.
Let's take the final question in addition. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I was going to ask that is there studies done on how to react to the climate change and how to decrease the pressure of immigration from, for example, in Africa? I've been happy to work there with the African soils for maybe 12 years. And now I have the feeling, and I know that we call the so-called yield gap is there quite large. So those areas, still in those areas, in large areas of Africa, the climate is still good for producing much higher yields than they now can. Like in Europe, we produce maybe 80% of the yields that the climate, the yield potential, but in Africa it's only maybe 20 to 25%. So with our technologies, we could increase the yield in Africa practically. Of course, there are dry areas, but of course there are plenty of areas where there will be more rain, even more rain. So, are there any studies of this kind of aspects?
Well, there are. I start with that question. There are several studies on those issues, very differentiated. If you look at the IPCC reports, the overall report, the last one is 2014, but there is one new on its way. And there is definitely a very differentiated situation, which is also part of what has to be taken into account when considering possible migration consequences. There are really areas where appropriate policies, appropriate funding will reduce the risk of migration to zero. And that's why also one of my previous conclusions was that the number of people who will be displaced depends on the level of planning and investment. There are other parts of the world where the issues are more, really more problematic and where it cannot be excluded that several, that important populations might have to move. But again, one of my central messages is that the diagnosis has to be differentiated, and it's not possible to make a kind of overall statement regarding those issues. And definitely, this is a conclusion that I haven't really put to the fore, but a few years ago there was one publication in Migration Studies with the title "Bringing the State Back In," and definitely if you look at, I teach a course in master, we have a master on migration, on migration theories, and you look at all the very sophisticated theories of migration that have been produced in history, but at the end, if you look at the extent those theories were able to appropriately describe the migration flows, you realize that the variables of the power relations and the policies is the one which finally at the end made the difference, even if according to neoclassic theory the difference in wages and in utility expectations and blah 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 is huge. To a large extent the states managed to control and to either encourage or discourage migration, and this is still, in my view, the case. Although it's not possible to seal a border, it's absolutely impossible. It's a fantasy, it's a mad fantasy to think that it is possible to close a border. But this doesn't mean that migration is not manageable and controllable when you have the power, and the states have the power, and currently worldwide migration would be completely different if the power of the states was not controlling it. So it is a central, absolutely central dimension, definitely.